Spring lay gently on the road leading to Waka Academy. The valley opened in soft tiers, and the path curved between low stone walls where moss and lichen held on. Students in loose robes moved like a flock from one hall to another. No one checked who entered. Entrances were routine here. John and Magnolia arrived without urgency. They paused at a bend in the path to let a cart go past, and then continued. A swallow dipped low over the stream and rose again. The academy came into view piece by piece, a tower with vines climbing its stones, an open courtyard where someone had hung laundry, and a crooked bridge of bleached wood that led across a narrow ditch. The journey to Waka had taken them through fields of barley and stands of old oak. Magnolia had enjoyed the rhythm of the walk, the way her boots settled into the dust, the way John hummed songs he only half remembered. At one point he had found a broken wagon wheel by the roadside and turned it into a game, rolling it down a hill and cheering as it bounced. Magnolia laughed despite herself, the first time in days she had laughed without weighing the sound. "Not much ceremony," John said now, lifting his hand in a lazy salute to no one in particular. Magnolia glanced at him. "You seem disappointed." "Not at all. Ceremony makes for poor walking. Besides, it would slow us down." "And you dislike being slowed?" she asked. "I dislike being commanded to be slow." They found the inn just beyond a line of cedar trees. It leaned slightly toward the road as if listening to conversations. Inside, the proprietor poured them water and assumed they were students. 2 small rooms were made ready without question. The mattresses were thin but clean, and the windows faced the sunlit yard where cats slept on the stones. "Separate rooms," John said with mock offense. Magnolia answered with a mild look. "We have only just arrived." John laughed softly, and the conversation moved on without embarrassment. He inspected his room and declared it perfect because the window faced east. Magnolia inspected hers and declared it adequate because it contained a chair. When they compared notes later, both admitted the real attraction was that the innkeeper had not asked for names. The day was long, and they spent it walking the academy grounds rather than talking of their purpose. They passed open-air lectures where instructors pointed at diagrams drawn in sand. They sat on the edge of a fountain and watched a class practice spells that spun thin threads of light between their fingers. Magnolia dipped her hand into the water and felt the chill, while John traced lazy circles on his sleeve. Once, a group of students asked if they needed help finding their classroom. John thanked them and sent them in the wrong direction, which made Magnolia shake her head and smile. At midday they bought bread and cheese from a vendor and ate sitting on a low stone wall overlooking a garden. The garden was in disarray, as if several botanists had argued about what should grow where and then left in a huff. Magnolia pulled a sprig of rosemary from the nearest bush and held it to her nose. John watched her with a look that was both teasing and appreciative. "That suits you," he said. "The herb?" "The act of smelling herbs while appearing thoughtful." She lowered the sprig and arched an eyebrow. "And what act suits you?" "Being inappropriate at the wrong moment." "You are very good at that." He grinned without taking offense. "It is a calling." The conversation drifted. They spoke of the road they had taken, of the innkeeper's strange cat who barked at passers-by, of the way the academy's main tower leaned just enough to make visitors uneasy. They did not speak of the vortex or their next objective. Those concerns existed elsewhere. Here, the midday belonged to them. In the afternoon, they explored a market where students sold charms and trinkets. Magnolia tried on a ring carved from bone and decided it made her fingers look long and severe. John tried to trade a handful of pebbles for a wooden comb and was politely refused. They passed a booth where a boy recited poetry for coins, and another where a girl spun small storms in glass bottles. "Do you want one?" John asked, pointing at the bottles. "I would rather make my own weather," Magnolia replied. He tilted his head. "That is perhaps the most arrogant thing you have said." "It is not arrogance. It is an aspiration." He laughed, and she laughed with him. The sound relaxed the space between them. That evening they sat on the inn's balcony with 2 cups of tea. The light was golden on the rooftops, and the air held the smell of roasted grains. They could hear someone playing a reed flute in the distance, the melody simple and sweet. "We should plan," Magnolia said. "We just did," John replied. "We planned to watch students fail simple tricks." "You know what I mean?" John turned his gaze from the sky to her face. There was a softness in his expression Magnolia had noticed only in the last weeks. He held it now without comment. "Tomorrow we'll explore the library," he said, "not to steal anything, yet, but to understand how they catalogue their madness." Magnolia nodded. "And after?" "We wander some more. We find which doors open and which don't. We listen to gossip. I've always been a good student." Magnolia let the words settle. She did not know why the idea of staying here, of breathing this light and listening to students argue over theories they would soon abandon, felt comforting. Perhaps it was because no one looked at her with pity or curiosity. Perhaps it was because John did not hurry her. "You look at home," he remarked. "It is easier than being at home," she said. "Is that a compliment to Waka or an insult to your past?" "A bit of both." He smiled without pressing. The conversation drifted again. They spoke of the constellations that would be visible later in the season, of the best way to fry mushrooms, of the first time John had accidentally set his own sleeve on fire. Magnolia listened to his stories with interest, surprised by how easily he offered them. She countered with a tale of climbing an apple tree as a child and refusing to come down until she had eaten her fill. He teased her for being petty. She teased him for being reckless. As the light dimmed and the first stars appeared, Magnolia watched John's profile. The lantern outside his room cast a glow on his jaw and cheek. She had always understood her companions as necessary or useful, rarely as interesting. John was both, and he was also something she had not yet named. When he laughed, her stomach tightened. When he grew serious, she waited for him to speak. In the quiet, she allowed herself to feel the warmth that had been growing between them. Before they retired, she stood at the top of the stairs and turned back. John was halfway down the hall. He looked over his shoulder and gave a casual salute. "Sleep well," he said. "You as well," she replied. She watched him disappear into his room. Her own door closed on soft hinges. In the darkness, she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the distant murmurs from the common room and the occasional creak of the house. She imagined the road to the vortex. She imagined John's hand in hers as they stepped through whatever lay ahead. Then she shook her head at her own foolishness and smiled. Outside, the cats fought over a fish head. Inside, Magnolia slept. Morning came with thin light and the sound of students sweeping the courtyard. Magnolia woke with a sense of purpose and a flutter she did not immediately recognize. She sat on the edge of the bed and thought of John's laugh from the night before. The memory made her smile, and then she felt foolish for smiling. At the orphanage where she had grown up, mornings had been loud and competitive. Children had fought over bowls of porridge and the best seat at the table. Affection had been a scarce commodity. given out in rare glances from the overworked caretakers and snatched in quick moments between chores. Magnolia had learned to observe from a distance. She had learned to listen more than she spoke. She had never learned to let her guard down. There had been a girl named Vera who used to braid Magnolia's hair while they sat on the steps and watched the boys wrestle. And even that memory felt like it belonged to someone else now. Here, in a room that smelled faintly of cedar, she found herself brushing imaginary crumbs from her robe and wondering what John was doing. The thought surprised her. She pulled on her boots and decided she would not overthink it. They met in the yard. John was balancing a broom on his chin to the amusement of two younger students. When he saw her, he nearly dropped it, then recovered with exaggerated grace. "Good morning," he said, his voice brighter than the sky. "You could have been sweeping," Magnolia teased. "I find sweeping inefficient. Balancing entertains more people." Magnolia rolled her eyes, but felt her cheeks warm. They spent the day in idle mischief. They moved a sign that directed first-year students to a lecture on plants, sending them instead to a workshop on stone carving. They swapped the covers of two identical texts on Maner theory and watched as a student cited the wrong author confidently. They discovered that by wearing robes and arguing loudly about imaginary assignments, they could walk into nearly any lecture hall without question. Whenever someone asked them a direct question, John would answer with utter seriousness, no matter how absurd the content. Magnolia would nod along, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. They also lingered in places Magnolia would never have dared linger alone. They sat in the back of the dining hall among a group of boisterous alchemists in training. They shared a dish of seared mossback koi with a pair of exhausted healers. Magnolia listened to the rhythms of academic life with fascination. At the orphanage, knowledge had been something whispered by older children to younger ones, scraps of information about herbs or geography passed along with stolen bread. Here, knowledge was given away for free, and John stole it anyway because he could. At one point, Magnolia pulled John into an empty corridor and pressed her back against the wall. A group of instructors passed by, arguing about vines that refused to grow in certain patterns. Magnolia held her breath and felt John's arm brush against hers. He leaned closer than was strictly necessary, his shoulder touching hers. She could feel the warmth through the fabric. When the instructors were gone, neither moved away immediately. "You were always this bold?" John asked softly. Magnolia said nothing. They slipped out into the courtyard and laughed quietly together. The sound of her own laugh surprised Magnolia. It had been years since laughter had come out of her without restraint. In the afternoon, they sat on the steps of a side building and shared a stolen apple. Magnolia told John about the orphanage, how the roof leaked, how the older girls slept near the chimney for warmth, how she used to imagine a family that would appear and claim her. She spoke of the day she realized no one was coming. She described the small pleasures, stealing a handful of berries from a merchant's stall, eavesdropping on travelers telling stories around a fire. She spoke of Vyra, who had left one night with a travelling troupe, and how Magnolia had envied her courage. John listened without interrupting, occasionally brushing a grain of dirt from his sleeve. When she fell silent, he reached over and took her hand. "I cannot change any of that," he said, "but I can promise never to make you fight for breakfast." Magnolia laughed, then realized he was serious. He squeezed her hand gently and let go. "Why are you this kind?" she asked. "Kind? You must have the wrong person." Magnolia laughed gently as John shook his head with exaggerated fervor. The afternoon stretched. They wandered down to the practice field, where students attempted to levitate objects and often succeeded in making them tremble. John commented on their form with the kind of confidence reserved for people who know they are about to be wrong and do not care. Magnolia corrected him when his comments veered into nonsense. Their voices grew softer as the day wore on. Later, they followed a group of second years into a lecture on elemental modulation and took seats at the back. John whispered irreverent commentary on the instructor's gestures. Magnolia tried not to laugh. When they pretended to copy notes, their hands brushed more than once. They allowed it to happen. By the time the sun began to sink, Magnolia felt the flutter in her chest had solidified into something more tangible. She liked the way John looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She liked the way he spoke to her as if she were the only person who could understand his jokes. She liked the way they moved together, as if they had been doing so for years. On their way back to the inn, Magnolia reached up and pulled a sprig of leaves from a low-hanging branch. She tucked it behind her ear without thinking. John glanced over and reached out, adjusting it slightly so it sat more securely. His fingers grazed her hair. "There," he said. "Now you look like a real scholar." She tilted her head. "Is that what scholars look like? Girls with leaves in their hair?" "The best ones do." She laughed. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, their shoulders occasionally bumping. At one point their hands brushed. Magnolia could have moved away. She did not. John's fingers curled around hers naturally, and they walked like that for a while, neither drawing attention to it. Back at the inn, the common room was filled with low conversation. The innkeeper's cat greeted them with a disdainful glance, then flopped over onto its back. Magnolia laughed again. John insisted on bowing to the cat, which made it flick its tail in disgust. They ate dinner across from a travelling merchant who told them about a storm that had washed away half the bridge to the east. They exchanged stories about weather and travellers. John embellished his tale of turning a tavern fire into a cooking stove, while Magnolia described a market day that ended in a food fight. Their eyes met across the table more often than necessary. That night, as Magnolia lay in her bed, she allowed herself to think of the possibility that she was falling in love. She did not say the word out loud. She did not even fully admit it to herself, but she did not push it away either. She fell asleep with a smile on her lips. In the small hours, she dreamed she was back at the orphanage, but the rooms were filled with books and friendly voices. John appeared in the doorway, wearing a student's robe, and held out his hand. She took it. The dream dissolved, but the warmth remained. Weeks turned into months at Waka, not through idleness, but through the steady rhythm of work. The days were filled with lectures, pranks, and shared meals. The nights were filled with study. What began as curiosity gradually drew them back again and again to a quieter wing of the academy, where Bahihi had spent years tracing the same problem across walls and paper alike. It was not an assignment in any formal sense, but a question he had refused to abandon, the true nature of the vine wall that separated their world from whatever lay beyond. Most had learned to accept it as a boundary. Bahihi had not, and without quite meaning to, neither had they. Magnolia found the assignment first. She brought it to John with a grin. "I've found something impossible," she announced. "Impossibility is my favourite challenge," he replied. They set to work. They gathered texts from every corner of the library, from the open shelves and the restricted stacks they accessed through stealth. They read by candlelight and by moonlight. They debated over diagrams and formulas. They disagreed and then found common ground. Their heads bent close together as they pored over texts written by scholars long gone. Their voices were quiet so as not to attract attention, but their expressions were animated. Respect grew between them that was not based solely on affection, but on admiration. John realized Magnolia's mind was as sharp as her tongue. Magnolia realized John's curiosity was matched by his patience. When one faltered, the other pressed on. They took long walks to clear their thoughts and returned with new ideas. Sometimes they walked along the old stone wall at the edge of the campus where ivy clung and bees hummed, discussing possibilities without drawing diagrams. Sometimes they sat on a hilltop overlooking the academy and watched the sun set behind distant hills while they tried to turn metaphors into equations. The work consumed them in a way that was neither frantic nor obsessive. It became a practice, like meditation or gardening. They found satisfaction in small discoveries, a miscopied numeral that had misled generations of students, a metaphor used by an ancient scholar that turned out to be literal. They laughed over footnotes, they argued over punctuation. Once, John fell asleep mid-equation and drooled on a page. Magnolia teased him about it for 2 days. In turn, he threatened to tell everyone about the time she mistook a recipe for a spell and nearly summoned a loaf of bread. After nearly 2 months, they hit upon something. Magnolia was running her finger along a line of an old treatise when she stopped. "This diagram assumes the vines are impermeable," she said slowly. "They behave as if they are," John replied, rubbing his temple. "What if they aren't? What if they simply appear so because of how the energy flows through them?" John frowned. "They stop things. That's the definition of a wall." "What if the wall is a membrane?" Magnolia said, her eyes lighting. "What if it can be passed in both directions under the right conditions?" John stared at her, then at the diagram. Slowly, understanding spread across his face. They began to redraw the model, allowing for bidirectional flow. The equations that had resisted them suddenly aligned. The diagrams that had been knotted began to make sense. They checked the work twice, then 3 times. Each time, the result held. "It's possible," John whispered. "It's possible," Magnolia echoed. They wrote a paper together. They did not share credit with anyone else. They presented it quietly to a professor known for dismissing anything that was not his own. He read it once, then again. His eyes widened. This suggests that the barrier is not absolute," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It never was," Magnolia replied. "We just assumed it was because we never questioned it." The news spread through the academy with the speed of a rumor and the weight of a revelation. Students whispered about the 2 outsiders who had solved a problem their teachers had ignored. Professors pretended not to care and then lingered outside the library to catch a glimpse of the paper. Someone pinned a leaf to the notice board with a message. "Membranes go both ways." For a brief moment, Magnolia felt a swell of triumph so large that it surprised her. She had spent most of her life feeling invisible. Now, whispers of her name floated through hallways. She turned down offers to speak in front of classes. She declined invitations to dine with faculty. She did not want to be celebrated. She wanted to share a look with John that said, "We did this." In the quiet of the library, after they had made their discovery, Magnolia and John stood between 2 shelves. The afternoon light filtered through a window, dust motes turning in the beams. She looked at him. He looked at her. For a moment she thought he would lean in. For a moment she thought she would let him. Her heart beat faster. She felt the warmth of his hand near hers. Then a young girl darted past them, chasing a runaway scroll, and the moment dissolved. John chuckled and helped the girl pick up the scroll. Magnolia smiled and swallowed the words she had been about to speak. They did not speak of the almost kiss. Instead, they finished copying their paper onto neat parchment. They signed it together. John insisted on writing her name first. She insisted on flipping a coin for it. The coin landed on its edge on the table. They both laughed and wrote their names side by side. The evening before they submitted the paper, they sat by the pond near the far edge of the academy. The water was still, and the surface reflected the orange sky. Magnolia threw a pebble and watched the ripples. "Do you ever think about what lies beyond the wall?" John asked. "All the time," Magnolia replied. "And does it scare you?" "It doesn't scare me as much as staying here forever does." John considered that. "I fear boredom more than I fear most creatures." "Then you should avoid the company of scholars," she said, bumping his shoulder with hers. He bumped back gently. "They aren't all that bad." She let the comment hang in the air. It made her stomach flip and her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. After the discovery, she caught herself looking at John differently. He was still the man who made jokes about fire and carried no regard for ceremony. But he was also the man who had worked for months by her side, who had respected her mind, who had shared her joy. She wanted to lean into him, to press her lips to the corner of his mouth, just to see if he would smile into the kiss. She kept her hands to herself and her thoughts to her mind. But the desire was there, and she did not deny it. Professor Behihi noticed them more often after the paper circulated. He was a thin gobo, with a voice like a reed and a reputation for knowing everything that happened within the academy. He approached them one afternoon as they were leaving a lecture. "I hear you two have been busy," he said. "You really need to increase our workload. It just isn't quite enough," John replied politely. "Stop it, John," Magnolia scolded him gently. Behihi's eyes narrowed slightly. "Please continue your work. Passing the wall is something all gobos dream of." "We will do our best," Magnolia said with an almost smile. Behihi nodded and walked away. John watched him go. "He knows something," he murmured. "Of course he does," Magnolia replied. "Everyone knows something. The question is whether we need to care what he knows." John grinned. "We should care enough to ruin his plans." Magnolia laughed. It was a new sound for her. She found she liked it. That night, as they sat in the library copying diagrams, John brushed a stray strand of hair from Magnolia's face without thinking. His fingers lingered for a second. She did not flinch. They both pretended nothing had happened, but the air between them hummed. Weeks of study had brought them closer than any shared battle could have. They spoke in shorthand now. A glance could convey an entire argument. A raised eyebrow could end a debate. When Magnolia grew frustrated, John would mention a ridiculous theory he had heard in the dining hall. When John grew impatient, Magnolia would recite a poem she had half remembered from childhood. They were a team. When they finally turned in the paper, their hands brushed again as they laid it on the professor's desk. Magnolia looked up at John and saw pride in his eyes, not just in the work, but in her. She felt the same. They walked out of the office and into the twilight with a sense that something significant had happened, even if they did not fully grasp its implications. They returned to the inn late one evening with the intention of plotting how to derail whatever meeting Behihi might be planning. They sat at their usual table with 2 mugs of warm beer and a plate of bread and cheese between them. The fire burned low, and the innkeeper had already begun to sweep. Outside, a damp wind whispered against the shutters. "So," Magnolia said, dipping her bread into the melted cheese, How do we ruin his meeting?" "We don't," John replied, leaning back in his chair. Magnolia raised an eyebrow. "We don't?" John shook his head. "We don't attend it at all. We break into the library instead." Magnolia laughed, thinking he was joking. When he did not laugh with her, she realized he was serious. "You want to steal the book?" she asked. "I want to see if we can," he said. "After all, we've been invited to a library we can already enter. Where's the fun in that?" Magnolia considered. She thought of Behihi's narrow eyes and condescending tone. She thought of the adrenaline that rushed through her when she and John had worn stolen robes and slipped into lectures. She thought of the thrill she felt whenever they moved in tandem, wordless and efficient. She put down her bread and nodded. "Let's do it." They left the inn by the back door. The night was clear, and the moon lit the path. Crickets sang in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. They approached the library from the east, where a row of fruit trees provided cover. The leaves whispered in the wind, and the smell of ripening plums hung in the air. It turned out they weren't the only ones with the idea. Two figures dressed in dark colours slipped ahead of them, moving with the precision of trained spies. "Come," John whispered as they crouched behind a hedge. "How do you know?" Magnolia whispered back. "Just look at the way they move. Incredible how one can make spy work look boring." Magnolia smothered a laugh. They watched the spies pick the lock on a side door with practiced ease. "Do we interfere?" Magnolia asked. "Of course. We can't have them stealing the book we intend to steal." They moved as one. Magnolia shifted a pebble with her foot, sending it rolling into a tin bucket. The sound echoed. One of the spies froze. John plucked a leaf and flicked it at a nearby torch, extinguishing it with a small spell. Darkness fell over the side door. The guard at the corner called out, and footsteps approached. The spies panicked. One darted inside. The other tried to slip back into the shadows, but tripped over the bucket Magnolia had nudged. He fell, and John was there, hand outstretched, as if to help him up, only to twist the man's wrist and guide him toward the approaching guards. "There he is!" John exclaimed. "Caught him sneaking about!" The guard thanked John and dragged the spy away. The first spy, hearing his companion's capture, attempted to flee with the book already in hand. Magnolia stuck out her foot at the perfect moment. The spy stumbled, tossed the book into the air, and tried to regain his balance. John snatched the book before it hit the ground. He bowed courteously to the spy, who cursed in a language Magnolia did not recognize before being seized by another guard. "Thank you for returning the text," the guard said to John. "Any time," John replied cheerfully, tucking the book under his arm. They walked away quickly, but not so quickly as to draw attention. Magnolia could feel her pulse racing. It was not from fear, it was from exhilaration. She glanced at John. He looked as if he were returning from an evening stroll. When they reached a shadowed alley, they stopped. John leaned against the wall and let out a breath he had been holding. Magnolia laughed, though quietly. "That was ridiculous," she said, breathless. "That was fun," John corrected. "We just coordinated a burglary and framed two spies," she said, still laughing. "We make a good team." She did not disagree. She could feel her heart pounding, not from fear, but from exhilaration. They stood close, hidden by darkness, the only light a sliver of moon that caught the line of John's jaw. Magnolia felt an urge to reach up and trace it. She did not. Instead, she touched his arm briefly to steady herself. He placed his free hand over hers for a moment, squeezed gently, then let go. Back at the inn, they retreated to the small sitting room off the kitchen where a single candle provided light. It was late enough that the other patrons had retired. The innkeeper had gone to bed. The only sound was the occasional hiss from the hearth as embers shifted. They sat on the floor and placed the book between them. It was old, bound in dark leather and embossed with a design of swirling waves. Magnolia ran her finger along the spine. "Ready?" John asked. She nodded. He opened the book. The pages were thick and yellowed, and the ink had browned at the edges. They flipped past the front matter and looked for the section on the vortex. The handwriting was neat, and the diagrams were simple. They read aloud, alternating paragraphs, their shoulders touching. Their heads leaned together in the dim light. Their breath mingled. Magnolia felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. The book was less a treatise than a journal, full of observations and musings. One section noted how the current around the vortex flowed like a slow spiral. Another described the way the mist above it obscured the stars. They made small comments to each other. John underlined a phrase with his finger and whispered, "Poet." Magnolia underlined a calculation and whispered, "Terrible math." They laughed quietly. It felt almost like reading by the fire at home, if Magnolia had ever had a home with a fire. At last, they came to a chapter titled The Dark Ocean Vortex. Magnolia's voice softened as she read, the words almost an excuse to remain close. The candle between them burned low, its light steady, warm. John had leaned nearer without noticing. Their shoulders touched. Then their hands. She did not pull away, neither did he. For a moment, the book no longer mattered. The weeks at Waka, the long nights, the quiet understanding between them, it all settled into something simple, something undeniable. Magnolia lifted her eyes from the page. John was already looking at her. There was no hesitation this time. She leaned in first. He did not move. At first, she thought he was teasing her. Then she saw it. His expression had changed. Not uncertainty, not restraint. Something colder, disgust. John's gaze had shifted past her. Magnolia stilled, confusion flickering through her. For a brief, fragile second, she wondered if she had misread everything, if this had only ever been one-sided, if she had stepped too far, too soon. "John," she said quietly. He didn't answer. His eyes had dropped back to the book. Magnolia followed his gaze. The page remained open between them, unchanged, indifferent. She read the line where his eyes had stopped. 100 barrels of human blood to quiet the old gods that churn beneath the vortex, tested. The air seemed to leave the room. The crackle of the fire continued. The distant murmur of the common room did not cease. But inside, everything slowed. Magnolia looked up. John's skin had gone pale. He did not move. He did not speak. She felt nothing at first. Then she felt a hollowing out. All the warmth she had been nursing seemed to drain away, leaving a chill behind. John swallowed. "That's a lot of blood," he said after a moment, his voice thin. Magnolia stared at the page. The neat handwriting did not tremble. The diagrams did not fade. The requirement was clear, and it was monstrous. She felt her heart harden. She felt something break. They had spent months growing closer, trusting each other, laughing together, discovering together. They had just outwitted spies and professors and stolen a book for the thrill of it. They had almost kissed more than once. She had allowed herself to imagine a future. Now, there was a cost she could not bear. "Why would Constantine demand this?" John whispered, more to himself than to her. His fingers tightened on the edge of the book until his knuckles whitened. "To keep people away," Magnolia said, her voice quiet. or to ensure only certain people would come? John's jaw clenched. We can't. He stopped. There was no sentence to finish. Magnolia closed the book slowly. Her fingers lingered on the leather cover. She met John's eyes. They were as shocked as hers were. There was a sadness there too, and something like anger. Everything we've done, she said, has been built on the idea that if we worked hard enough, we could find a way through. Now we have a price, John said. She replied with silence. They sat in silence. The candle flickered, casting their shadows against the wall. For the first time since arriving in Waka, there was nothing playful between them, no teasing, no light remark to soften the edges. Magnolia felt the distance between them, even as they sat shoulder to shoulder. It was not a distance of space, but of uncertainty. After a while, John reached out and took her hand. He didn't squeeze, he didn't speak. He simply held it, letting their fingers entwine. Magnolia held on. The world outside the inn continued. Crickets sang, the wind shifted, someone laughed in their sleep. Inside, Magnolia and John sat with a book closed between them and a future that had become far more complicated than an unsolved assignment or a stolen prank. They stayed that way until the candle burned down.